Hello, my name is Joseph Villerin. I'm a psychiatrist and neuroscientist from New York City, and it's my privilege to speak to you today about psychosocial challenges that children in war zones may face, uh, as well as our means of supporting them through this adversity. And I'm going to be talking in particular about evidence that has been gained through the experience of other nations and what practices have been shown to be helpful. With that setup in mind, I reflect that we're seeing obviously the return of large-scale war in Europe, which hasn't been seen obviously on this level since the Second World War. But within recent memory, we have the experience of the Balkan Wars in the 1990s uh, that actually furnish a lot of the evidence that we have available related to the experience of children, their psychosocial development and risks in the course of modern warfare. Unfortunately, with both the invasion of Ukraine starting in its full-scale phase in 2022, as well as more recent conflicts cropping up around the world, we are seeing an increase in the number of children who are living in conflict zones and exposed to this kind of unfavorable circumstance. So in this presentation, I have two major goals. Firstly, to help you to recognize the potential psychosocial impacts of war across the developmental span of childhood, and what are the specific risk factors that predispose to negative outcomes. And also to make you familiar with some evidence-based practices for intervening with trauma-exposed children, as well as what prevention efforts are useful so that children do not develop trauma and stress-related disorders as a consequence of those exposures. So before we can talk about some of the aspects of intervention and prevention, we need to understand what is the nature of war's psychological impact on children. The fact is that this can take many forms. Children exposed to war or terrorism can develop sometimes multiple forms of psychosocial disturbance, and these may be more or less long-lasting. So the forms that these can take include anxiety disorders, acute stress disorder, which may develop into PTSD, depressive disorders, dissociative states, which are forms of essentially becoming disconnected from broader reality or from one's own emotional states, aggressive and disruptive behaviors, attachment patterns that may be insecure or atypical, which we'll talk about further, as well as substance use disorders. It's important to recognize that the typical responses in children to these kind of exposures of war and terrorism, violence, that they differ widely across the age ranges that we consider to be parts of childhood. So preschool age children, which are typically less than 6 years old, are often going to manifest symptoms of trauma exposure in the most vague and somatic ways, meaning that they might not be able to verbalize the sensation of being anxious or depressed, but it manifests in complaints like having stomach ache or headache, or on the other hand, sleep problems. Another thing that is very typical in this age range is magical thinking, which is to say that children of this age don't fully understand the consequences of actions oftentimes. And for instance, they may feel that bad things that are happening in the environment are really due to them, things that they did. So they might feel guilt or self-blame. They might be confused about the nature of what's going on in the environment and whether it relates to them, for instance, being a bad kid. They didn't listen to their parents. These are very typical kinds of thought patterns in this age range. As children grow up in more of the school age range, you see some more typical responses of fearfulness, anxiety. Children in this age range are very attuned and reactive to the anxieties of their caregivers. So they may pick up on the fact that the adults in their lives are more stressed, are easier to become angry or snap. And they model some of the same behaviors that they see in the adults in their lives. On the other hand, children in this age group can also display regression in their behavior, which is essentially reverting back to the patterns of earlier age ranges. So things like thumb sucking or becoming attached to a particular stuffed animal or safety object, wetting the bed. These can happen as a result of exposure to traumatic stress. And children may also begin to become defiant or refuse to go to school as a result of their anxiety and the reactions that they're having to stressors in the environment. In adolescence, teenagers, one of the changes that begins to happen and the challenges that is faced by adults in their lives, by care professionals, is that they may be more likely to keep their feelings hidden, to keep up appearances, to try to be strong for their family or community members. And this may lead to depressed mood, that without that outlet to really be honest about how they're feeling, basically it manifests in other ways. Another concern that is prominent in this age range is the susceptibility to radicalization. Obviously, this is not something that is so prominent in earlier ages, but with greater adoption as children get older of internet devices, social media, of being exposed to news media, they are more likely to become exposed to these kinds of opinions, this kind of propaganda that may lead to stronger desires for revenge against the people that they perceive to have hurt them. So I wanted to give some special attention to that early childhood period, because I think many people can probably recognize the symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of hyperarousal, hypervigilance, re-experiencing symptoms, negative changes in mood and cognition. But not too many people are familiar with how stress-related disorders can manifest in much younger children. And here I'm talking about that age range of preschool children who are typically younger than 5 or 6 years old. In the United States, we have relatively new diagnoses for these stress-related conditions of early childhood. The first of which that I want to talk to you about is called reactive attachment disorder. Basically, a child with reactive attachment disorder is typically fearful, untrusting, hypervigilant, unable to be comforted by the people who are supposed to be caregivers in their lives. They're often aversive to touch, and will have difficulty displaying positive emotions like affection. May seem to lack empathy and not take care of themselves well, may neglect their own hygiene and physical appearance. These kinds of stress-related disorders were first described in institutionalized children, basically orphan children, for instance, living in parts of Eastern Europe in the 1990s. So this is in some sense a kind of experience that is relatively close to home in terms of Ukraine's experience. But basically the instability of not having a primary caregiver, being either in foster homes or in an institutionalized environment where there isn't one or two, there are basically zero stable caregivers for the child, can manifest in this way. So a child that's very withdrawn and reluctant to become attached to any particular person who's supposed to be their caregiver. This would be a classic example of insecure attachment. In more recent years, we've become increasingly aware of the fact, though, that this isn't the only way that a traumatized young child may behave. And in fact, it has been distinguished from this earlier diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder that there are some children who might have a rather disinhibited type of social engagement. So these children, again, with similar risk factors of not having stable caregivers in their lives, potentially being in an orphanage or other institutional environment, that these children lack normal social caution. They may go without any kind of reluctance and with over familiarity to strangers. For instance, a child with this kind of disinhibited social engagement disorder may very well, without thinking or any kind of reluctance, just walk off with a stranger, even away from the person who's supposed to be their primary caregiver. And other ways that this can manifest are, the children being perceived as attention-seeking or very showy or inauthentic in their emotional expression, having difficulty forming deep, intimate relationships with peers or with caregivers, and everything remaining more on the superficial level. This is also an attachment disorder, basically. But instead of having the insecure attachment that is more characteristic of reactive attachment disorder, this is what you might call atypical attachment. It's still an abnormal form of how attachment would normally develop in a child who didn't have these kind of stressors and had more stable basis of support and caregiving. Besides these kind of diagnostic possibilities, there are 4 areas that I think are commonly overlooked where the impact of war, of violence, of terrorism can be displayed prominently in the experience of children of all ages. The first being that in cases of war, there can be oftentimes severe disruption in access to education, which should be a normal part of every child's life and growing up. Having to have school in a bomb shelter, or not being able to get to school because of destruction of the physical environment, is obviously ways that this can be manifest in children's lives. Obviously, another factor that goes along with this is the opportunity for displacement from their native place, family separation when evacuations happen, the possibility of institutionalization for children who have experienced loss of their family, of their primary caregivers, and they have no other place to go. Tied in with the idea of institutionalization, of family separation, war definitely increases risks for children who already have disabilities, to say nothing of those children who are tragically maimed and experience new disability as a consequence of war. This may be a factor of, again, destruction of the physical environment. If a child already faces mobility problems, being able to get around in cases where streets are not easily navigable, or being, for instance, for children who have special needs and are either living in group homes or other institutions, that there may be contexts in which they are overlooked for evacuation or placement in a new location as a result of the exigencies of war. And then the last, potentially overlooked dimension of this impact of war that I want to highlight is the disparate gender-based experiences that children can have. And I want to zoom in on this a little bit more. So it's fairly clear that women and girls, especially, are more vulnerable to the psychological consequences of war. Looking at data from many different countries around the world, whether within Europe, in the Balkan states, for instance, in Israel and Palestine, other countries in the Middle East and in Africa that are affected by these conflicts. And one thing that is really worth highlighting is that there is a very strong correlation between mothers' distress and that of their children. So the mental well-being, psychological well-being of mothers is a major predictive factor for that experienced by children in war situations. In this same breath, we have to mention sexual violence, which obviously can take place in the context of war. It is worth noting that this phenomenon, unfortunately, affects boys and girls alike. Although statistically speaking, girls are affected in higher numbers. And lastly, tying back to some things that we've talked about already, there is evidence that gender gaps in education often become greater as a result of becoming a refugee or an internally displaced person. And in many countries, this is disadvantageous to girls because there are already disadvantages faced by girls in those societies in terms of education. Interestingly, I'm not sure that this necessarily holds true for Ukraine, at least in evidence that I was able to see from pre-war statistics. It seems like this might be, in terms of predisposing children to less educational attainment, that sort of thing. This might actually be more of a problem for boys in Ukrainian society in comparison to girls. And one could speculate as to, what are factors that contribute there, such as, for instance, potentially the pressures put on males as they come of age in society, potentially to join the military or to take up the role of being a primary breadwinner, person supporting their family, for instance, if other male relatives are already serving in the military. Other risk factors for negative outcomes that I want to highlight are, it appears that adolescents who are exposed to trauma, as well as children who are living alone or in small family units, are more prone to developing psychiatric disorders as a result of their experiences. So it's worth paying special attention to these groups, adolescents and children who are relatively socially isolated. Other important variables that determine the impact of war on children's mental health include lack of basic resources like food, water, shelter, schooling, access to healthcare. The disruption that takes place in family and community relationships. A psychological factor that's worth highlighting here is pessimistic outlook. So children who persistently feel loss, grief at their circumstances, who are unable to perceive a brighter future, the opportunity for hope in the future. And then lastly, the concepts of normalization of violence and facing stigma and discrimination within society, perhaps as a result of refugee or displaced status, or of disability incurred in the course of war. So we've talked a lot about the nature of the problems, the psychosocial problems that are faced by children in war conditions. What are some evidence-based interventions for dealing with these problems, for promoting resilience among children? I want to emphasize that the single most effective early intervention for preventing later stress-related disorders in children as well as in adults is getting them out of immediate harm's way and the physical environment that has been degraded by war and made unsuitable for human living. On the other hand, there's robust evidence that it is not helpful to engage in psychological debriefing, and that this may actually lead to worse outcomes for people who are exposed to psychological debriefing. In particular, here I want to mention the idea of emotional ventilation, basically forcing or encouraging people exposed to traumatic circumstances to let out their emotions, if that's not something that they're inclined to do or prepared to do, right? Prompting them to do this kind of performance of emotion, there's strong evidence that this can actually be harmful and increase the likelihood of PTSD-like symptoms in the future. And so through meta-analyses and recent studies within the past 20 years, it has become a strong recommendation that any kind of compulsory psychological debriefing with trauma victims should stop. In contrast, educating people who are exposed about common trauma responses that people might experience, so that if in the future they experience those symptoms, it's not so mysterious to them and they can actually relate it to their experience of trauma, may be helpful. And otherwise, psychological trauma can be dealt with by professionals essentially in a screen and treat model. So with a few simple questions, screening people who are exposed for PTSD, and in the context that it has been identified that they have symptoms suggestive of PTSD, treating that appropriately with pharmacological or psychotherapeutic means. One of the most insidious effects of war is its disruption of traditional communities, traditional ways of life. And here in particular, it's worth mentioning that traditional social supports, which include but are not limited to local faith leaders, birth attendants, that these are really crucial to promoting the well-being of mothers and, as a result of what we had discussed previously, thus their children. It's worth saying that a key strength for children being able to cope with any form of adversity is having one or two stable caregivers in their lives. Usually this is going to take the form of their parents. But in the case of children who are separated from their parents or who are institutionalized, having even just one person who is a stable, close point of contact can make such a huge difference in preventing, for instance, the kinds of insecure or atypical attachment patterns that we saw can emerge, especially in young children who have no one who is a stable caregiver or point of contact for them. And lastly, I want to say that there's evidence that engaging children in group activities with their peers, that may include things like cooperative play, collaborative problem solving, these kinds of activities that foster a sense of community and positive shared experience can be very helpful for children processing negative experiences like the traumatic experience of war and violence by promoting this idea of what's called in literature cognitive social capital, which is essentially another way of saying how people perceive the level of trust and mutual support, solidarity within their communities. This is actually increasingly seen as a critical point for communities to heal from circumstances of war, of internal division, and other kinds of challenges essentially to the makeup of society. So with that, I'd like to conclude by just bringing home a few specific points. One being that being exposed to war or other traumatic circumstances, that it's not fate. It doesn't lead inevitably to any form of psychological disorder or other, disruption of a child or a person's place in society. The story, by and large, for the majority, mass majority of people, is that we are remarkably psychologically resilient. And even with people who are exposed to these traumatic experiences, only a relatively small fraction go on to develop significant and enduring psychological disorders as a consequence. That's not to say that it's not understandable and in many ways normal response to those experiences for people to have those struggles. But it's just important that we don't give people the impression that by having this exposure, they are fated to struggle as a consequence. In fact, what I hope I've conveyed to you is that there are concrete, modifiable risk factors that can be taken advantage of that improve children's ability to cope with these kinds of adversity or unfavorable conditions. And I think one that speaks to me the most personally, but is also something that each and every one of us can act on and take to heart, is fostering that connectedness of children who are in these conditions to caregivers, to peers, to the wider community. Because isolation, as we've seen, is a very negative factor in terms of dealing with these adverse conditions. And lastly, again, just to highlight that special attention needs to be paid to groups that are particularly vulnerable, the disabled, people who are facing material deprivation, like a lack of basic resources as a result of war, those who have relatively few social connections. So supporting the safety and well-being of these groups in particular can have an outsized impact in preventing psychosocial disruption in their cases. With that, I would like to thank you so much for your attendance and for hearing what I have to say. I hope that this presentation has been helpful. And now I believe there's an opportunity for translation and further discussion of my talk. Thank you for having me.